Alright. Well, welcome everyone. This is one of our two English events in the Marx Festival 2013. For those who want to listen to the recording of our last event, you can go to our Facebook page. We have the recording there. Well, welcome once again. I'm Ho-Lok Chen. I'm the manager of the Coming Society. The Coming Society is a second-hand bookstore, and we are also a cultural entity that we organize a series of concerts, cultural events. Marx Festival is one of our attempts to bring in intellectual intervention to social movements and cultural interventions in Hong Kong. This is our second year organizing this series of events. Today we are very glad to have activist Mr. Ning Chen and lecturer Jacky who will join us in discussing Marxism today in cyber age, where we are facing the production, a totally different production mode, where we are indulging ourselves in the production of science, and what insurrection would mean in this kind of age. Well, without further ado, I would invite Jacky today, our host, to start the event. Thank you.
Thanks. Good evening and welcome to be here with us. Welcome to the Human Society. I, with my comrades, colleagues, we belong to a local association called Left 21. We promote leftist ideas, Marxist ideas, insurrectional ideas in Hong Kong, and we hope to promote social movements to render a society of equal people, no matter what races you are. So thanks to Common Society for the coordination and the venue here, well air conditioned and very comfortable. And so here, let me introduce to you our guest speaker, Ning Chen, who is a friend of mine and who is engaged in numerous social movements in Hong Kong, Occupy Central, and Chen Lei, some of you might know, and workers' movement, and so on and so on. So I'll let him talk about. And my specialty is philosophy, and so I invite Ning Chen to share with us his thoughts on cyber Marx, communization, and insurrection in the age of Semiocapitalism. I expect we will have a lot of discussions about the present stage of capitalism, what it means for Semiocapitalism. I'll hear what you say. And I hope to reflect upon the significance of Marx for Hong Kong. As some of you might know, Marx thoughts have long been neglected in the academia in Hong Kong, and so I hope to have some more discussions on that. And so I pass the time to Ning Chen.
Maybe I should start with some shameless self-promotion first to kind of supplement what Jacky said about Chen Lei, which is the group that I'm part of, and some of us are here tonight actually infiltrating this event in a very sinister way. Chen Lei, like we're a store in Yau Ma Tei, Kowloon, and most of us used to be part of the original Occupy Central and HSBC headquarters, kind of effaced from the historical archive now because of the huge media preoccupation with the so-called new Occupy Central, the Love and Peace Occupy Central. But after we were cleared out, we wanted to kind of have a concrete space for us to continue to carry out the sort of experiments with social relationships that we were doing in Occupy Central. And the store is, I guess, what I would call kind of, it's the best way to describe is maybe to call it an autonomous community center in a way, trying to do communal neighborhood organization in that space. And yeah, if anybody's interested, we can tell you more about it. I don't know if we brought cards with us tonight or not, but well, we can bring cards, but we can write down a Facebook group or something. And another thing I would like to say to kind of preface this talk at the beginning is I'm not a Marxist. So I mean, I consider myself a lot closer to anarchism, and a lot of times I would say I'm an anarchist. And yeah, so I think that's important to know first of all, because a lot of times I kind of feel that, as Jacky said, Marx being somebody that's kind of obscured or somebody that's neglected, and you know, a lot of times people on the left will say things like, oh, we need more Marx, you know, people need to read Marx. And I'm in total agreement with that, because I feel as though, you know, whether we like it or not, we are all, you know, as Godard once said, we are all the children of Marx and Coca-Cola. The Coca-Cola part, I mean, you can take it or leave it. But I think as far as all of us being the children of Marx goes, I think that's a very accurate thing to say, because, I mean, first of all, there's the undisputable fact that Marx has been such a major influence on so many material historical events in the 20th century. And the other thing is that Marx is somebody that I don't think that anybody can ignore. The fact that his vitality is proven by the fact that people still need to continue to refute him or to dismiss him as being nonsense. You know, whether you're a neoliberal economist or somebody working in the economics department of the university or whatever, his discourse is not something that we can ignore. And for any of us that are involved in, you know, projects of liberation or emancipation or social transformation or whatever, Marx is this huge shadow that we all have to come to terms with. But I feel like kind of one of the huge problems a lot of times when people say, okay, we need more Marx, we need more Marx, what they're trying to advocate is not really a patient and a critical elaboration of what reading Marx would mean, with all of his complications and contradictions, because the legacy of Marx is so riven with contradictions and antagonisms, and the history of interpretation of Marx has led to, you know, a lot of people losing their lives, as we all know. And a lot of times this concrete history of struggle and contradiction inside the interpretation of Marx is kind of erased for something that's a lot more doctrinal, you know. People produce a very, very programmatic kind of Marx. And it's all about a system of transmission from, you know, the people that know this systematic theory and the people that don't know this systematic theory. So it's like handed down in that way. And when Marxism becomes such a professorial kind of thing, I think it's a really, really huge issue. So kind of cyber Marx, I have to admit that, you know, before this talk, like a lot of people ask me, so what is the cyber part in cyber Marx? And I have to admit that this talk, I don't know whether you're going to receive an answer to that question. I feel like it's kind of false advertising in a way, because it sounds very catchy. Because this kind of derives from a conversation that I had with Hollog, like before the Marxism Festival happened, because Hollog is actually my roommate. Yeah, we were talking about, you know, what kinds of topics we could have in this year's Marxism Festival. We kind of threw a whole bunch of things out there, like, I don't know, like Marxism and animals, and Marxism and queer politics, Marxism and eroticism, Marxism and the internet and all this kind of stuff. And then he just kind of said, hey Nick, can you do like a talk on like cyber Marx, because there's a book called Cyber Marx actually, which I think is like really worth reading if anybody's interested. I think it's, I can never remember the guy's name, like Nick Dyer Witherford, yeah. Yeah, and I mentioned the book to Hollog and he was like, oh, that sounds like a really good title, so you know, we should run with that. So here I kind of find myself having to substantiate why I chose the title. I have a cop out by saying that I wasn't actually the one that chose the title. But what I kind of want to talk about today, because today's talk is actually a continuation of a talk that I gave at the Asian Art Archive a few weeks ago. what I talked about then was Situationist International. It's just a group of people that came out of the Western artistic avant-garde. They came out of Dada and Surrealism. And what did they do afterwards? They were very important in the legacy of May 68. Like, they participated in the occupation of the Sorbonne, and they helped to try and organize wildcat strikes in the factories and stuff like that. So I was kind of talking about how the Situationist International broke out of the problematic of the Western artistic avant-garde at that time to try to create a very interesting synthesis between aesthetics and politics at that time. And I also tried to, in a way, kind of briefly touch on the legacy of 68 and how, you know, the traces of that have left itself in reinterrogation of like the whole Marxist lineage and the whole Marxist legacy. And today what we're going to talk about, like Cyber Marx, in the blurb that the Coming Society had for the event, they talked, the blurb has something about Italian autonomism. And that's very closely related with our subject today, because what I kind of wanted to talk about in these two talks was the fundamental reevaluation of Marxism and all the basic categories in Marxism by the two events, 1968 and 1977 in Italy. I don't know how many of you know about the long period of emancipation in Italy in the 60s and 70s, from like 1968 up until maybe the end of the 70s. I mean, I want to make this brief because I don't want to, first of all, I don't really like, you know, talking for long bouts of time, because I'm always afraid everybody's going to fall asleep. And second of all, I think having some extremely long, like, historical elaboration of what happened is really boring, especially if there's no, like, you know, visual supplement in the background. But, you know, there have been so many films that have been made about the whole legacy of May 68. You know, whether that owes itself to, you know, the explosion of, like, the French New Wave and things like that. But, I mean, even today, like in Hong Kong, every year there's a French May Festival. Anybody that lives in Hong Kong will know about that. But, you know, a lot of times in the program they will have some films about May 68, and, you know, every year in France they do the same kind of thing. And, like, Sarkozy, when he got elected, said, like, okay, we have 2 weeks to destroy the legacy of May 68 and stuff like that. So it's like a legendary event for anybody in the Western world, or people who, you know, consume Western cultural products on a daily basis. But, you know, what happened in Italy in the 60s and 70s is a lot less commented upon. And actually, what happened in the Italian 60s and 70s was a lot more sustainable than what happened in May 68. Because May 68, you get this big, you know, romantic explosion where, like, the students and the workers converge. The Italian 68 was actually very, very similar to that. But what made the Italian in the 60s and 70s very interesting was what the Italian autonomists of that time, the autonomists, they were actually a group of professors. I think they were largely concentrated in Milan at that time. The most famous of them is this guy called Antonio Negri. He's like, you know, a left superstar now. But he originated from those struggles at that time. And they formed a group called Potere Operaio, like workers' power. And they did what they called workers' inquiries, like going to the factories in Milan and Turin, and doing very concrete questionnaires as to, you know, how the workers, like what the workers' lives are like, what the shifts are like, you know, how they're able to communicate and socialize with each other inside the factories and stuff like that. And what they wanted to focus upon was, you know, worker self-activity inside the factories. And yeah, what happened in 68 was, you know, a whole cluster of strikes, a whole cluster of workers' struggles. And fast forward to 1977. 1977, we have a movement called Autonomia, the autonomy movement in Italy. And I think for any young person that has grown up in a counterculture, like for myself, like I came to anarchism through punk rock. So for me, reading about 1977 a few years ago, it just seems to me to be the most ideal period in history, because I mean, what happened at that time was in the factories in the north, there's a lot of the car factories in Italy were concentrated in the north, and the southern part of Italy is, considered to be like, the rural part of Italy. And in the factories in the north at that time, there was a huge exodus of like young southern people moving up to the northern factories. But the sense of temporality in these two places, in between the industrial north and the rural south, like the southerners brought with them what the autonomous thinker Franco Berardi called like a Mediterranean laziness. And he doesn't mean this, of course, in a pejorative or negative way. He meant that there's a certain sense of indiscipline, sort of indigenous indiscipline that came with the southern workers at that time. And the southern workers, like, there was a large mingling between the southern workers and a lot of the disenfranchised student population at that time. Maybe I should fill this in by saying that in 1977 in the universities, they had a very similar situation to what happened in May 68 at the time. Education was being expanded. Like the universities they were building a lot more universities, a lot more people were being included in university education. So a lot more people were being educated in tertiary education. And they were equipped with all this knowledge, but employment opportunities were shrinking at that time. And another thing we can say about the historical background at that time is that the Communist Party of Italy at that time, they decided to form a coalition in the government with Christian Democrats in Italy, which was traditionally considered to be a very conservative party. So what happened at this time was there was a huge defection from the Communist Party in Italy, and they kind of said, okay, I mean, you guys are just the police now. What happened to workers' liberation and all of that? So you started to see a lot of splinter groups inside the Communist Party. Like the most famous of these splinter groups is a group called Lotte Continua. I think that means like continuous struggle or something like that. Inside these parties, inside these kinds of fractional parties themselves, I mean, they were fighting for, worker self-emancipation, worker self-activity, rather than, this kind of bureaucratic emancipation of the workers by, like, the upper strata of the party and stuff. But in a group like Lotte Continua, something very interesting happened. There was a Lotte Continua Congress once. And there was a lady that stood up in that Congress, and she said, okay, in the Lotte Continua newspapers, there's never anything about women. There's never anything about women's issues. You never say anything about housewives, and you never say anything about the fact that, women are, in a way, doubly exploited. Because, first of all, a lot of them had to go to work in the evenings, and they had to take care of their children in the daytime. And so we're saying that, Marxism has always focused on the place of production. It's always placed emphasis on the place of production. They say, okay, in the place of production, that's where value is produced. In wage labor, you produce surplus value, and this produces profit, and that's what keeps the system going. But then this lady said that, okay, how about reproduction, like the sphere of reproduction? Like when the man goes home every day, and then the woman has to, iron his clothes, and then like put the food on the floor and go grocery shopping, and then like change the baby's diapers and all this kind of stuff. This is like the premise upon which, value can be produced at the place of production. So she was saying that all of this stuff is kind of occulted and rendered invisible by Marxist optic, and as a result, like women will always be secondary to the so-called class struggle that's waged at the place of production. And what happened is that in this Congress, like by being denounced in this way, like the leader of the Lotte Continua actually was so shocked that he said like a few years later, like he went behind the scenes and cried or something like that and had some like major crisis of confidence. But I mean, 1977 was kind of like this epicenter where these kinds of currents of emancipation could take place, whether intellectual or cultural. Because, I mean, the fact that so many young Southern workers were moving up to the North, and in 1977, I mean, this was the beginning of it. As everybody knows, 1977 is the beginning of punk rock in England. And there was a big countercultural, subcultural scene in Italy at the time. There was a group in Italy called the Metropolitan Indians, which is one of the groups that most people tend to remember because they had a very Dadaist kind of sense of humor, a very disruptive sense of humor. They used to dress up, with big head feather hats and tomahawks and stuff. And then they would go and steal records from the record store, and then go and watch movies for free, and do what they call proletarian shopping, run into supermarket, fill their shopping cart with all kinds of stuff, go outside and hand it out to people and stuff like that. So, I mean, at this time, you had these subcurrents of creativity and also real intellectual development, of the left, I would say. And the Southern workers mingling with these disenfranchised, really upset students who suddenly saw that the whole facade of the Italian Communist Party had pretty much evaporated. And it's from this episode of 1977. I should also mention one more fundamental event in 1977. I don't know if anybody knows, but there were the Red Brigades in Italy. The Red Brigades are kind of concurrent, simultaneous with the Red Army faction in Germany. That's a lot more famous, but they kind of did the same sort of stuff. The Red Brigades, they were also concentrated in the factories in the north, and they were informed by a very Maoist kind of ideology. And they always thought, because they would say things about the Metropolitan Indians hey, you guys, you're concerned with cultural change and all this stuff that's really peripheral. What we need to do is we need to take power. We can only take power if we have guns, So they formed guerrilla. They formed very, very tight, very centralized guerrilla columns inside the factories and armed themselves. And this resulted in the kidnapping of a Christian Social Democrat minister called Aldo Moro. I can't remember what the demand that they put across was. I would imagine something give us immediate power or we're going to kill Aldo Moro or something like that. Of course, the Italian government declined, and the Red Brigades killed Aldo Moro, drove a car out to a very public place, and they found Aldo Moro in the trunk. And this kind of led to the disintegration of the experiments in Italy at that time. It's very similar to what happened in Germany in 1977, when the Red Army faction made all social transformation a question of violence. And when the Red Army faction was in prison and they had very high-profile trials, the whole social movement had to waste its energy, kind of campaigning for their release and stuff like that. And it all became a question of a frontal confrontation between the military state and the police and, these guerrilla movements that had to hide underground. So that spelled the end of the episode of liberation of 1977. And kind of all of this led to a real questioning of the legacy that we traditionally conceive as being, so-called Marxism. Because I kind of feel as though, when we think about Marxism, we tend to think about some kind of relay race, It's Marx passes the baton to Lenin, and Lenin passes the baton to, and everybody claims, hey, I am the real Marxism, right? Whether it's Mao or whether it's Guevara or, Kim Il-sung or something. Everybody advertises themselves as being, I am what Marx said in Das Kapital, But I kind of feel even today, the whole Leninist legacy is still the hegemonic one. It's still through the prism of Leninism that we understand, what Marx wrote. And this can be, I guess, attributed to the fact that those huge historical state formations of the 20th century, adopted this interpretation of Marxism. But I think kind of one of the things that I think is very important, and one of the things that I would hope that this Marxist festival puts across is precisely how conflicted the whole history of Marxism is. Because, I mean, Leninism, as one interpretation of Marx, had to suppress a whole range of other interpretations in order for it to ascend and become hegemonic in the first place. And the autonomist reflections that came out of 1977 is one of these currents, connected to a very vibrant and very active social movement. I think I'm gonna pause there.
Okay, so can we go to So can we go to the discussion on Semiocapitalism? Testing. So according to Brigades and some others, Semiocapitalism is what characterizes present stage of social development. And according to you, what is the difference between Semiocapitalism and capitalism, traditionally understood as a system incorporated the social, economic, and political dimensions into a system of exploitation? So, according to you, what is the main feature of Semiocapitalism? What does semio signify? To what extent is Brigades' work relevant to our reflection on capitalism nowadays?
I mean, the prefix semio comes from, semiotics is the science of signs. So when he says semio-capitalism, it's a capitalism fueled by signs. And Franco Berardi, I think, is an author that I very much recommend. Like, I have very, very high esteem for his work. He is a thinker that came out of 1977 as well. He's like most well known for being at the center of the Radio Alice experiment. Radio Alice was kind of like it was a pirate radio station, which was totally unprecedented in 1977 because the state had control over every single radio station at that time. And they invented a kind of decentralized radio network that would transmit news all across Italy about, police suppression and what was happening in the occupations and all this kind of stuff. It was a very, very interesting experiment at the time. But since then, like over the years, he's kind of produced a very fundamental reflection on what he calls semiocapitalism. And this theory of semiocapitalism derives from, I think, two principal sources. Like the first of which is Deleuze and Guattari's Capitalism and Schizophrenia. Because Berardi was very, very good friends with Felix Guitari. I don't know when I drop all these names, I don't know if people are familiar with kind of what I'm talking about. So I don't want to kind of overwhelm everybody with this avalanche of names that has no significance for anyone. So if anybody doesn't know what I'm talking about, let me know. Oh, you don't know. Felix Guattari was a psychoanalyst. He trained under Jacques Lacan, who is, I guess, the most so-called important psychoanalyst since Freud, people say. But he gradually became very disenchanted with Lacan because Guattari at that time was involved in, he was heavily involved in a lot of different social movements at the time. But also because he kind of felt that Lacan's model of how to understand schizophrenia and psychosis was totally inadequate. So what Guattari did was he founded a clinic on the outskirts of Paris called La Borde. and tried to create kind of a more non-hierarchical, more participatory environment in which there's no discriminatory distinction between people that are so-called normal and people that are abnormal, to try to create a new kind of therapeutic practice. And the second source of Berardi's theory of semiocapitalism is Jean Baudrillard. It's like a very, very overlooked and very, very neglected theorist in our time, I think. Reading Baudrillard is kind of being censored by the academic establishment in a lot of ways, I think, because, you know, there's this kind of, you know, it still provokes a lot of ambivalence today when people say, like, oh, postmodernism, you know, like, you throw the word postmodernism, everybody's just like, ew, like, what is that, you know? Like, and postmodernism has become kind of this, like, catch-all phrase for, like, everything that's bad about our world, you know, like disorientation, like confusion, disintegration, like, you know, everybody's just, like, you know, in their own private world, having their own private language, and there's nothing that can, like, you know, draw us together again. And Baudrillard is often, like, accused of being responsible for, like, you know, making us see the world through this kind of optic. But, what Berardi took from Baudrillard, and I think, like, maybe here I'd like to summarize a little bit of what Baudrillard was talking about. I think Baudrillard wrote a few very, very important books at the beginning of his career. There's a stretch, like, there's a book called The System of Objects, and then after The System of Objects he writes a book called The Consumer Society. After The Consumer Society he writes The Mirror of Production, and then yeah, I think these three books are very important for what Berardi was talking about. But what Baudrillard was trying to do, because Baudrillard was somebody that came out of Marxism, and he actually, a lot of his thinking was kind of very inflected by the Paris Maoism at the time. You know, like, Paris Maoism, like, actually, if anybody wants to study it, is actually quite a hilarious thing if you look at it these days, because, I mean, you know, in everybody got these very romanticized notions of what the Cultural Revolution was, you know, and they're like, oh, Chairman Mao is, like, leading, you know, this, like, orgasmic, like, emancipation of the world, you know, and, like, so it's all kind of inflected through this kind of very romanticized idealization of what was going on in China. But Baudrillard became very active in May 68 because he was teaching in Nanterre, and you know, some of us may know that Nanterre is kind of where the explosions of May 68 actually started. And Baudrillard kind of was led to a very fundamental interrogation of, like, what happened in May 68, like, how come the Communist Party in France, you know, sold May 68 out and, like, restricted it to just simply being, you know, the workers bargaining with the state. And Baudrillard started to reread Marx in a very fundamental way, and he wrote a book called The Mirror of Production. And in The Mirror of Production, Baudrillard kind of says, you know, Marxism is a kind of theoretical imperialism, like, it's a form of academic colonization. And a lot of these arguments sound very familiar to us today, you know, like, today a lot of the post-colonial theorists, they would say that, okay, Marxism comes out of the West, and because Marxism comes out of the West and out of this whole lineage of the Enlightenment, and the Enlightenment likes to present itself as being something universal and applies to every kind of society, blah, 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 then, like, we have to kind of, you know, deconstruct this kind of universalism. But what Baudrillard was saying was something a lot more drastic. Like, he said that Marxism is a form of theoretical imperialism because it has this concept of modernity and progress. And because it creates this kind of model where it's like, okay, you go from primitive, you know, to, like, you know, modern and advanced, and, like, you know, modes of production succeed each other and one is more advanced than the other one, you know, then it has no way of understanding pre-modern societies. And it will always relegate pre-modern societies to being retrogressive societies. But what Baudrillard found in primitive societies was something that defeated the whole Western conception of production and progress. Because what Baudrillard said is that in pre-modern societies, there's actually no such thing as labor. in the sense that we understand it, or in the sense that Marx understood it, as a subject, transforming the objects, like subject transforming nature and then becoming himself and all this kind of stuff, producing objects of use, value, or exchange. Like Baudrillard said that in pre-modern societies there's actually no such thing as this. We cannot use labor as a universal term and apply them to pre-modern societies to understand them. And he would also say that there's no such thing as production, and in a lot of pre-modern societies there's no such thing as economy either. So if we reduce all societies to this kind of paradigm, then we are in fact, first of all censoring history, and second of all blocking off understanding of a society that's radically different from our own. So Baudrillard said that actually in this way Marx is totally complicit with capitalism, because Marx already plays into this kind of subject-object, like, subject removed from nature kind of model that was already produced by the Western Enlightenment and bourgeois thinking, whatever. But another thing that Baudrillard started to notice at this time was, like in his book The Consumer Society, he started to say that, a lot of times Western critical thinking, or Marxism in particular, places emphasis upon the activity of production. Like production is where value is produced. Like men, working on material objects and like really creating something that people can use as material and tangible. And a lot of times, like we have this kind of thinking where we think that, okay, consumption is something really mindless and stupid. It's like people who produce are doing the real work, and people who consume are like, doing nothing. They're just like passive idiots who like, fall for the ploy of advertising and just buy any kind of crap that people tell them to buy and all this kind of stuff. But what Baudrillard was saying was that, with the development of technology, and this is already something that we see in Marx, technology is linked to productivity, and productivity means like extracting more and more labor power to create more and more surplus value. But also, like, technology succeeds human beings, right? Technology makes human beings superfluous because it can intensify the extraction of value from a body, but in that case, then it doesn't require as many workers to man the machines. So Baudrillard was saying that, let me gather my thoughts.
What makes the consumption of science, according to Baudrillard, what makes the consumption of science, what makes consumption in the year 70s somehow different from the consumption in late 19th century, for example, by means of international trade, by means of mechanical production of large scale. So what is the role that science played in consumption in the post-war years, according to Baudrillard, for example?
Okay, to answer this question, usually when we think about when we think about a commodity, Marx divided commodity between use value and exchange value, right? Like an object, let's say, for example, this bottle of water, right? And this speaker here. Like, Marx would say that each of these is absolutely unique and different, in the sense that, okay, like this bottle of water and this speaker, if you didn't have some kind of abstract equivalent to compare these two things, they wouldn't be compared. Like, you wouldn't be able to establish like how many bottles of water are worth this speaker, because in fact these are totally independent from each other. And Marx would say that this difference between the two objects, like use value, is like the use is totally different. Like I use the bottle of water to hold water, and I use the speaker to.
You can enjoy your microphone in a different way then.
Yeah, but I mean, Baudrillard came up with a very radical reevaluation of this whole concept. I mean, first of all, he said that the use value of an object is actually because Marx always tended to treat the use value as something that's natural. Like if we get rid of money, what we have left is useful objects. But Baudrillard kind of said that, we're too fixated with the materiality of use to see that in our society, the use value is actually an alibi for the exchange value. What he means by that is that, okay, for example, if you have like, you know, a food processor, for example, like a really futuristic looking, really cool looking food processor, and the food processor has like 1,000 different functions or something. And you look at the manual, it tells you how to use all the 1,000 different functions. But in reality, you're only really going to use, I mean, unless you're some professional chef or something, which is a very small percentage of us, you will probably only use like, you know, 8 or 9 functions out of the 1,000 functions. But like, what this refrigerator sells to you is really, you know, the idea of functionality. Like, you buy the idea of functionality. And like, Baudrillard started to notice that this is what he would call, you know, kind of sign value. Like, what you consume in our economy is not something tangible or material. Like, what you consume is actually something symbolic. You consume a kind of meaning. And this is very prevalent today. Like, I was reading an article today about like what they call the kind of experience economy. Like, I don't know if everybody knows about the experience economy. Like, it's really something new to me because, like, you know, I'm really alien to that kind of world and what goes on in advertising and marketing. But I do feel like we all should be a lot more cognizant, and we should all be a lot more in touch with these kinds of developments. Like, what happens in management, what happens in advertising, what happens in marketing and stuff. But like the experience economy, like, as I understand, I mean, I mean, people here can correct me if I'm getting it wrong, but the experience economy is about consuming your own subjectivity, in a way. Like, what people need to do is provide you with the premise or the environment for you to have a certain kind of experience. And I read this, like, advertising manual about the experience economy. They were saying, okay, if you sell sofas, if you sell refrigerators, like if you sell chairs, if you sell, you know, like shoes or whatever, what you need to advertise is not the good itself, but you need to advertise the experience. You know, you need to advertise the refrigerator experience. Like, I don't know what that is, but, you know, I mean, I think, you know, that's where advertising comes in, because you got to use your imagination, right? But,
for example, to make up a furniture with different parts of the chair, you make it into a chair by yourself instead of buying a chair well designed. So just now you mentioned to me another example, IKEA the other day, and does it have something to do with this kind of experience economy?
We actually had kind of like a dress rehearsal for this talk on Tuesday. Like, I don't know how effective that is, or whether this seems very elaborately orchestrated. I would imagine not. But, I think one of the other fundamental, very, very important things that Bifo Berardi, like, I really recommend a book that he wrote called The Soul at Work, From Alienation to Autonomy. What he kind of talks about in The Soul at Work is he's trying to really problematize the basic Marxist idea of production and labor and work. Because, you know, a lot of times we think about work as being something that's fundamentally demarcated from non-work, right? And this is something that we inherit from, you know, the industrial age of capitalism. You know, like the old idea of like in the coal mines or like in the factories in Manchester, you know, like they go and work these back-breaking, really grueling shifts, and then later they all go to the pub and sing workers' songs and stuff like that, you know. Yeah, I mean, you used to have this kind of separation. But what is in fact happening now, and this comes from what we were talking about before, like, you know, this questioning of like the division of production and reproduction, and why Marxism always focuses on the place of production at the expense of what happens outside. Bifo was saying that, you know, nowadays this line between work and non-work is collapsing. The division between work and life is collapsing. And I'm sure, like, all of us are very familiar with this. I mean, you don't really need a theorist to tell you about this, actually. Because, you know, I mean, even people that have to go to an office or whatever, you know, they have to sit in front of a desk for that long. But then, you know, they stay you know, after proper working hours and do overtime, as long as they take their work and go home, and every time they carry their cell phones with them, and the cell phone is like intimately imbricated with their work. And Bifo, like, you know, I mean, he actually calls, you know, the cell phone. Microphone experience. But, yeah, Bifo would say that, you know, a lot of times now we think that, you know, if we are freelancers, you know, whatever, like, you know, a lot of us at the store are freelance workers for various reasons. But, you know, if you're a freelance worker, you don't work in a physical location. Like, as a university researcher, like, I usually used to work in cafes and stuff. And, you know, the so-called means of production that everybody carries with them is like a smartphone and a computer. And this allows you to be continuously plugged into the network. And really all you need to do is to be plugged into the network and work on whatever semiotic material you have to work on, whether that's like research or whether it's data processing or whatever. But this decentralization of work that seems to be such a emancipation, you know, people being emancipated from, you know, the grueling, alienating place of production and being able to, like, you know, work on their own hours or whatever. What it actually means is that, you know, work has consumed, like, the entirety of life. Because it's not simply that you are working all the time, but, I mean, you also have to take into account all the other things, like, you know, working on your so-called employability, or, like, you know, trying to find work in between contracts and everything. I mean, this is the phenomenon that everybody calls precariousness in North America or Europe. So, yeah, I mean, this is something that he talks about throughout the book. He talks about the cell phone actually being a kind of leash rather than, you know, being a tool of liberation in any way. But kind of another thing that I want to talk about is that in Marxism, you know, when we talk about the concept of exploitation, I feel like most of the times when people think about Marx, you know, the first thing they think about is exploitation. Or at least it doesn't matter, like, you know, if you go to university, if you study cultural studies or you study sociology, you study whatever, the first thing they tell you about is exploitation. And, you know, they give you this very, very schematic, like, you know, conception of, like, you know, the whole law of value and where does profit come from. And a lot of times this fixation on the worker in Marxism derives from exactly this preoccupation with the place of production. Because we're so fixated with the model of wage labor, you know, we think that, okay, wage labor is where all profit comes from, where all surplus value comes from, that's what makes the wheel go round, so we need to, like, you know, stop it at that point. But what Baudrillard says is something very interesting. Like, he puts forward this notion that, you know, when we think that wage labor is the producer of value, what we kind of lose touch with is the fact that in our society, more and more technologies and instruments are being developed to kind of produce value through our everyday activity. And this is like something that we can explain very, very simply, like in two ways. First of all, like when Jacky was asking me about IKEA, just now, like IKEA is a very interesting example because, and kind of ties into our whole, what we were talking about, the experience economy just now, because, you know, I don't know how many people enjoy shopping at IKEA. I kind of don't, but, you know, I mean, a lot of us don't really have a choice because we don't have money to do otherwise. But, you know, what everybody's familiar with the experience in IKEA. You know, you go and then you have this stupid, like, little pencil and then you fill out the form, and then, like, you know, you take the little tag and then you go to the warehouse and then you have to carry these huge things and, you know, move them back and find a way to transport them back to your house. And you notice that, like, in IKEA, there are very, very few attendants that are actually there. Like, you basically have to do all the work yourself, you know. I mean, whether it's like, you know, going to the warehouse and taking it, putting it in the trolley and then moving it back home, and then you have the joy at home of like, you know, taking out all the pieces and then finding all the little bolts and then like putting them in and all that kind of stuff. So it gives you like a sense of artisanship, you know, it gives you this sense of craftsmanship, like, hey, I'm really, you know, materially like making something, you know, and you bring people to your house, you're like, yeah, I made this bed myself, you know. It gives you like a real sense of pride. And like, yeah, I mean, IKEA's whole profit model like derives from that, right? Like basically all the labor is kind of outsourced to you, and then you kind of consume the experience of like building things. And I mean, another model is like, you know, the Web 2.0 model, right? Like something like Google Chrome, for example, or like, you know, a lot of privately owned software that like beta tests things on users first, like, you know, what they call so-called crowdsourcing. Like, you know, a lot of very enthusiastic consumer communities form, and then they like, you know, beta test like software, and they beta test like, you know, like web browsers and stuff, and they form communities to kind of help to troubleshoot, like, you know, how to solve problems and all that kind of stuff. And all this stuff is, you know, I mean, it's fine, you know, like it's a form of like mutual self-aid or whatever among like consumers. But I mean, it's totally free, you know, for whatever corporation or company is marketing these products. So what Berardi would say is like, you know, if you focus on the place of production, you kind of neglect the fact that value is produced in like, you know, our everyday activity, and what we traditionally consider to be consumption. Consumption being something that's non-productive, you know, in the Marxist conception. Like a lot of times we just think that, okay, production is where people really make things, and consumption is where people just use things, and they could, I mean, that's what consumption means. You consume it and you don't produce anything in return. But, you know, in the 60s there was a thing called Michel De Certeau, and he's like very important for cultural studies, and he kind of like was trying to attack this dominant leftist view that like, you know, consumers are just these passive people and they only use the product in one way. Like if the state wants to brainwash people by having a TV program, then it will broadcast this message, and this message will get like, you know, we'll suck it in our brains, and then we'll become these like mindless zombies and stuff. Michel De Certeau was like trying to explode this conception. He was saying that, okay, you know, like people use things in different ways, and like if I buy a pair of jeans and you buy a pair of jeans, you might wear the jeans like, you know, really high up, and I might wear my jeans and like show my underwear and like, you know, or like, you know, he might wear a pair of jeans and then he'll like cut some holes in it, and then he'll like look really grungy and stuff. So he was kind of saying that, like, okay, you know, like we all use these objects in different ways, in idiosyncratic ways, and we give them different inflections, and different symbolic meanings are produced by this act of consumption. And he thought that in this way there's something liberating about that. But for somebody like Berardi, or for somebody like Baudrillard, he would say that, you know, this is precisely what consumption is about, you know. Consumption is about defining yourself in relationship to other people. It's a form of hierarchization, or a form of differentiation in an age of so-called democratization, when like, you know, we're all equal or whatever. More and more divisions come about through this so-called production of meaning by individual usage. And yeah, Baudrillard would say that if we think about consumption in this way, we are fully inscribed, fully engulfed inside this so-called system of meaning, or the system of production of sign value that consumer society generates.
So I'm not sure if some of you here might think that what's wrong with consumption of science? What's wrong with capitalism, which provides us with more and more choices? We can make, we can design our room, we can design our apartment with numerous furniture of our choice. What's wrong with it? Choice is essential in realizing our freedom, in a sense. Although we are consumers, and just like in the case of election, just like in the case of election, we choose whom we think in election we can choose a politician who represents for us, who promotes the values that we treasure. In Hong Kong, that you can choose pro-establishment parties or pro-democracy parties. What's wrong with it? I'm not sure if some of you doesn't work somehow. Testing. So isn't it that IKEA provides us with more choices and help us realize freedom in a more genuine sense? What's wrong with it?
I don't think we're how to answer this question. What's wrong with IKEA? I don't know. 90% of the furniture in my house is IKEA. I think the answer to this question is it has to do with the question of proletarianization, which I think is one of the fundamental ideas that we still have to retain from Marx and also rethink in a very fundamental way. Because, I mean, another book that I kind of wanted to talk about today is, kind of what's considered to be required reading for people in the so-called anti-capitalist or anti-globalization movement, like Harden Negri's Empire. On the front cover of Empire, every copy of Empire, you see like a big tag that says Communist Manifesto of the 21st Century or something like that. We can neglect, such like nefarious advertising schemes, but what they talk about in Empire is they have this concept that they call immaterial labor. And immaterial labor, like to explain it in a very, very brief way, like they asked Michael Hart, like, what the hell is immaterial labor, those kinds of journalists, like, they don't want to read the book, they just want to ask the intellectual, hey, okay, give me like 2 sentences, tell me what the hell this book is about. So Michael Hart is just like, okay, when I think about immaterial labor, I think about, that smiley guy in a uniform standing behind the McDonald's counter. And he was kind of saying that, okay, like, today in today's capitalism, what we see is what they call like a kind of feminization of labor. Because why he calls it the feminization of labor is because traditionally we think of like, women as being, maternal caregiving people, they take care of the children and make sure everybody in the dinner party is okay and all this kind of stuff. This really like 19th century Victorian idea of like what women are supposed to do. So he can kind of say that this production of immaterial affects and immaterial feelings and social relationships and whatever is becoming integral and central to the development of our economy. What we're talking about with like the experience economy and things like this, if we go back to kind of what we were talking about the fact that value is being produced continuously in life rather than simply at the place of production. Because, today a lot of times on the left, I think this is something that's quite prevalent in Hong Kong today too, because in Hong Kong we have most dominant sectors in Hong Kong are what? Like finance, tourism, and the service economy. So a lot of times, we have to read Das Kapital would be like, hey, where is the worker? Where can the worker be found? And then we kind of look across the border and we say, okay, like they're in Shenzhen or they're in like, the coastal cities in like Guangdong and all that kind of stuff. So, I mean, this preoccupation with like the place of production can really blindside you to where value is being produced, like continuously. And what Hart and Negri talk about in Empire is they kind of say that today life itself is being made productive. Like they kind of take this reflection from Foucault's idea of biopolitics. They're saying that the bios or life's productive quality, like the collective creativity of people. Like a very general example they use in their book Commonwealth is they talk about Greenwich Village in New York. And they talk about, okay, you know, in Greenwich Village it's like all these, you know, really interesting people, like, you know, start living together, and then collectively, you know, they start to make the neighborhood like this. It's not like a conscious choice that they made, you know, they didn't have some technocratic program where they're like, okay, you know, I want the garden here, and then like the ethnic minorities here and all this stuff. But it just happened kind of spontaneously over years. Like Greenwich Village acquired all these traces and then all these practices or whatever that were generated organically by the collective everyday activity of people. And then, you know, of course we know like property developers capitalized on this, and then they marketed it as being, hey, this is a really chic, you know, hip neighborhood for you to stay in. So, like, this is kind of central to Hart and Negri's whole idea. What they would say is that, you know, if life is being made productive and capitalism develops more and more instruments and technologies to capitalize on this collective creativity of people, then, like, capitalism cannot be thought of in the old way, which is, you know, concentrate some workers inside a factory and then, like, make them, you know, work on assembly belts and to produce value and all this kind of stuff. Hart and Negri would say that today capitalism is parasitic rather than productive in that sense. Like, it extracts value. It finds more and more instruments to extract value from everyday life and to make life directly productive and capitalizable. It's a really horrible word, but yeah. I don't know if anybody's like really confused at this point, because no confusion.
Can I ask a question? How are we to think about the value that is produced within the mode of production with this new kind of parasitic value, or this cognitive production or semiocapitalism? What is the relationship between those two forms of value? How are we to think about that? Because it's not like exploitation has gone away. In fact, it's gotten worse. And I get a little bit nervous about these Italian philosophers living in a place where a lot of the, you know, the hidden abode of production is actually physically moved to another place. And it seems to me that China presents the possibility of maybe thinking a little bit more carefully about the relationship between the place of production and these new kinds of parasitic forms of value.
I kind of...
Can we see it in a kind of a circle? Is there like a connection between them that can help us comprehend